Bob Dylan has one of popular music's most unusual studio discographies. It includes many of the genre's most unforgettable albums, many of its most forgettable albums, and some whose strangeness almost defies description. For the last 2 months, I've been ranking them. Who am I, you say? Oh, just a Bob Dylan-obsessed singer-songwriter who's written papers about Bob Dylan, who hosts a Bob Dylan series at Cafe Wah where Dylan got his start, and who makes his own Dylan-esque folk rock music. Or in other words, a Bob guy. And after 15 years of Dylan obsession and countless arguments with myself and others about where each of these albums rank, the Bob Dylan studio album tier list is finally complete. What follows is a supercut of each installment in the series, segmented by decade. It's a journey from the 1960s through the 2020s, from Bob Dylan to Shadow Kingdom, and most importantly, from somewhat shorter hair to much longer hair. But before we commence, I want to let you in on a couple pieces of good news. The first is that the next installment of His Back Pages, my Cafe Wah Bob Dylan series, is taking place Sunday, February 23rd at 6 p.m. The theme of the show is Bob Dylan Plagiarist. Ooh. Tickets are on sale now, and there is a ticket link in the video description. We've got 4 of these shows this year, so if you can't make this one, be sure to sign up for my email list, also in the description, to learn about future shows. And who knows, maybe I'll bring the show to a city near you. The other good news is that this series vaulted me into the rarefied air of YouTube partnerdom. That means I earn a little bit of money from these videos. And transparently, YouTube pays creators like me according to how well we engage our audiences. Whether you've been following the series or you're new to my page, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Just know that it goes a long way toward helping me make more excessively analytical and verbose content. And now, the Bob Dylan studio album tier list. 1. Bob Dylan. Dylan at this stage was not writing a lot of original music. He was mostly playing folk covers. As such, this album consists mainly of folk covers. And like the folk covers on this album are perfectly adequate for the most part. Sometimes they're kind of goofy, like when he puts on this sort of old man gravelly voice that's so clearly not his. Waiting on my burying ground. It's a little bit, as the kids say, cringy. There are 2 original songs on this album. Song to Woody, which is, I would say, a good song, not an excellent song. Talkin' New York is the other original song on this album. It's like good, funny, but not like an innovative folk statement. If you really are interested in studying how Bob Dylan came to be, this is an interesting document. If, on the other hand, you are just wanting to listen to a very good album, this is probably not the one for you. I would put it in the C category. 2. The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. The Freewheelin' represents one of the biggest quantum leaps in quality between any 2 works of art in any artist's oeuvre ever. Bob Dylan's first album is a pretty decent collection of mostly folk songs and a couple of decent original songs. This album has some of the most classic songs ever written on it. Don't Think Twice, It's Alright, Blowin' in the Wind, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Girl from the North Country. I would also even put Talkin' World War III Blues in that category. The only thing that makes this not an S-tier album is some of the filler. Down the Highway I can kind of take or leave. Bob Dylan's blues, you know, overall it's a little bit of an uneven album, but the heights are so high. It's all but an S-tier album. For sure an A-tier album. 3. The Times They Are A-Changin'. This one's hard for me. There are so many exquisite songs on this album. Obviously, The Times They Are A-Changin' is a timeless classic. One Too Many Mornings is like just a great minimalist poem. Ballad of Hollis Brown is a really great, mean, dark song. Here's the thing that I can't quite reconcile or abide with this album is it's dour. It's just my philosophical aesthetic belief that when comedy and tragedy are together, the end result is stronger than when it's just represented by one or the other. And this one is kind of just tragedy. It does not represent the aesthetic magic trick of combining comedy and tragedy that made and makes Bob Dylan the Nobel laureate legend that he is. Its classic songs landed in the B tier, and its self-seriousness keeps it out of league with some of his more classic albums for me. 4. Another Side of Bob Dylan. Another Side of Bob Dylan, like Freewheelin', like The Times They Are A-Changin', is just full of classic songs. Chimes of Freedom is a strong contender for my favorite Bob Dylan song. To Ramona is maybe the Bob Dylan song that I like to sing the most. Spanish Harlem Incident is a great, funny, weird, underrated song. For those of us who have avoidant attachment styles, It Ain't Me Babe is kind of our anthem. The minor songs on this album I really like too. Black Crow Blues, for example, this has so many Bob Dylan virtues. It's funny. Dylan is in his early 20s here, and just writing songs that are of not just a wisdom, but a poetics well beyond his years. Of all these early acoustic albums, this is probably my favorite. And I'm going to do the controversial thing of listing this above Freewheelin' Bob Dylan in the A tier. 5, Bringing It All Back Home. Bringing It All Back Home is a superb album. Superb. It's not a perfect album. The main mark against it is that the songs on side 1, there are a couple that are dismissible. Outlaw Blues, for example. On the Road Again is also like a fun, funny, witty, cheeky blues song, but Maggie's Farm is just a better version of that song. Having said all that, the heights on this album are tied for the highest in his entire career. Mr. Tambourine Man, exquisite poem, exquisitely delivered. It's All Right, Ma. Gates of Eden, it's all over now, Baby Blue. Maggie's Farm, Subterranean Homesick Blues, Love Mine is Zero and She Belongs to Me. I don't think these are the best versions of those songs. Something about the sort of jangly, birdsy studio format just doesn't suit them in my opinion, but those are beautiful songs too. Bringing It All Back Home, I think, is for sure an S tier album. I think it's lower S tier ultimately, but it's indispensable. 6, Highway 61 Revisited. Ultimately, my philosophy of art and of albums is that a good album is in part defined by a total absence of excess. This, to me, is that. It has no dull moments on it. Like a Rolling Stone is often cited as his best song and occasionally cited as the best song. Is it the best song? No. Is it his best song? No. Is it a reasonable choice if you had to make a choice for those two categories? Sure. It has arguably his best song on it, but then also some songs that just hit in such a special way that's so hard to describe. Queen Jane Approximately is one of those. Just like Tom Thumb's Blues is another. Ballad of a Thin Man is a career-defining statement. Suffice to say, they are all great, and together in this sequence, they are greater than the sum of their parts, far greater than the sum of their parts. To me, this is the defining Bob Dylan album. It helps if you have a sort of appetite for poetic language. If you're that kind of person, this is what you should start with. It's his best album. 7, Blonde on Blonde. This album has some bloat. Temporary Like Achilles is not an essential song. Pledging My Time is not an essential song. Obviously Five Believers, while fun, is not an essential song. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, I really don't love. I don't love the imagery in that song. There's something about it that feels reaching. It's like reaching for the emotions that it's talking about. Having said all that, the lyrical style is still fresh, innovative. It's at the frontier of what popular music could be in that day. It is still part of the first great peak of Bob Dylan's recording career. The classic songs are too numerous to mention. I love Rainy Day Women. I think it's an excellent song. I think it's a darker song than people realize it is. I Want You, I love. Stuck Inside a Mobile, I love. Most Likely You Go Your Way and I'll Go Mine, I love. It is among the Bob Dylan albums that I've listened to the most, and there's just enough bloat to make it sort of a low S-tier album for me. 8, John Wesley Harding. This is an album that one of my friends thinks is the best Bob Dylan album. I think that is crazy. Just about all of the songs are these like minimalistic 3-verse songs where the story is a little bit unclear. I think the people who sort of view the simple 3-verse minimalist structure as an artistic decision are giving him a little too much credit. I think it's a little uninspired. There are a couple of classic songs on this album, All Along the Watchtower, I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. Some of the songs that are not timeless in his catalog are quite interesting, like Down Along the Cove. It's interesting. Dear Landlord is a musically a very rich song and lyrically an interesting song. I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine is interesting. Wicked Messenger is interesting. None of these songs are great though. The take that it's a minimalist masterpiece is overstating the case for this album. I would put it comfortably in the B tier behind Times They Are Changin'. 9, Nashville Skyline. This is the album in Bob Dylan's discography that's kind of like, and I hate that I'm referencing this, but I am. It's that John Mayer album, Born and Raised. The whole album in both cases is like essentially a costume. This one has a lot of charm. It's a charming costume. Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You is charming. Country Pie is sort of a funny country song. One More Night is a song I like. The song on this album that almost justifies the genre experiment is I Threw It All Away. It does what great country songs do, which is articulate a profound emotion with very few ingredients. As for the greatest hit on this album, Lay Lady Lay, I don't hate it, but I think of songs of his that appear on greatest hits albums, I think it kind of is one of the worst ones. This album to me feels like the first time in his career that he's really bereft for inspiration, and he's trying to find it by being something else. I don't hate this album, I listen to it. On the whole, I put this in that B tier behind John Wesley Harding. 10. Self-Portrait. Something you learn about Bob Dylan if you are a fan for long enough is that periodically throughout his career, he likes to desecrate prior versions of himself. At this point in his career, he's already done that once when he went electric. Self-Portrait, he has argued, and one could argue, is an intentional desecration of the messianic reputation that he had come to develop. Let's give it that credit and say that it's an intentionally bad album. Okay, but it's still a bad album. This thing is an unholy mess. It's not without its high points. Wigwam is kind of a nice song. Minstrel Boy could be a good original song, but it's not fleshed out. All the Tired Horses is a great opening track. It's a haunting composition and arrangement, and it makes you wonder what the hell he might have up his sleeve. The problem is he has nothing up his sleeve. The album consists mainly of covers, some of which are folk standards, some of which are more recent hits like Early Morning Rain or like The Boxer. The covers are almost without exception totally half-baked. I happened to meet recently a musician who played on this album. He basically said that Bob would start playing a song without giving anybody any directions or chord charts and just expect them to catch on, and you can hear that. It sounds like the kind of stuff you would record if you were learning guitar in 2006 and experimenting with GarageBand. This album is long, it's mostly unlistenable. If his goal was to throw people off the scent, he succeeded. I think you can give it some credit for having a credible concept, but Robert Christgau, the dean of American rock critics, made the most salient point about this album, which is that in order for a concept to pay off, you have to actually interact with the work of art. And this album is just no fun to listen to. It is a bad album, the first truly bad album of his career, and I put it in his F tier. 11. New Morning. Upon release, New Morning was heralded as a return to form. Is it a return to form? Kinda. There are a couple of things I love about this album. One of them is that it is a mood, or in contemporary parlance, is a vibe. What is that vibe? It is hanging out on the porch of your country home and feeling the time pass in a way that is sometimes immensely pleasurable and sometimes existentially dreadful. There are some really good compositions on this album. I love Day of the Locust. I love Went to See the Gypsy. If Not For You is a really sweet song. There are also some really crummy compositions on this album. Winterlude is not a bad song, but its title is so stupid. Three Angels and Father of Night are pretty forgettable. It's of a kind with Nashville Skyline. Very little about the crafting of these songs is groundbreaking. I would put it in the B tier behind John Wesley Harding. 12. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. The circumstances of this album are more interesting than the album itself. Sam Peckinpah, director of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, tapped Bob to do the soundtrack for this album. I have to think that Peckinpah was expecting more than he got. He got 2 songs and 8 half-assed instrumental compositions. The 2 new songs on this album are incredible. Knockin' on Heaven's Door is obviously very well established in the pantheon of classic rock. Billy is not, but it ought to be. The other thing people may not know about this album is it's where we got the song that would turn into Wagon Wheel. Dylan's version was tentatively titled Rock Me Mama. All he had was the chorus, and he just never finished verses for it. The songs on this album are great. The problem with this album is that there are 10 tracks and only 2 songs. The album as a whole is pretty forgettable. I would put this in Dylan's D tier. 13. Dylan. So again, the circumstances of this album are interesting. Dylan had just broken with Columbia Records to sign with Asylum Records and announced his first major tour in 8 years. And I think Columbia was feeling like, WTF, Bob. Even though the early 1970s is among the least inspired stretches of his recording career, he was still a big moneymaker for them. They were looking at a cash cow walk out of the pasture, if you will. This album is culled from the sessions for Self-Portrait. So this is rejects from his most widely rejected album to date. Dylan will never do the defining rendition of I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. Spanish is a Loving Tongue is a horrendous arrangement. Yes, there is some morbid pleasure to be gained from Sarah Jane and Lily of the West, maybe, and Big Yellow Taxi, but this album only is on this list by technicality. It's something that his record label released for reasons that either have to do with pettiness or have to do with fattening up their bottom line for the end of the year. There is no artistic gambit on this album, and so I put it in the very sparsely populated payback tier. 14. Planet Waves. Like New Morning, Planet Waves to me is less an album, more a vibe. The way Planet Waves feels to me is being in a big city and having a sort of secluded hangout with your close friends that has nothing to do with what is fashionable in the city at that moment. None of the mid-1970s emerging trends in popular music make their way onto Planet Waves. Whether that's an intentional artistic choice or an apathetic one is kind of beside the point to me. This is a nice Dylan mood, this album. And it has some really nice compositions on it. Forever Young is a deservedly classic track. On a Night Like This is a song I really adore. Dirge is also, I think, a better song than it ever gets credit for. It's like almost a satirically dark song. I love the chord progression in Tough Mama. The problem with this album is that most of the other tracks are pretty forgettable. There are precious few moments of inspiration in the rest of them. They just don't have any place among his best regarded tracks to me. Planet Waves is a vibe, and I would put it behind Nashville Skyline in the B tier. 15. Blood on the Tracks. If you were a Bob Dylan fan in the early 1970s, you could have been forgiven for thinking that he was never gonna make another excellent album. Blood on the Tracks is a wonderful album. It's often cited as his best album. I don't think it is, but it deserves to be among those cited that way. It has all the virtues of a great Bob Dylan album. The classic songs are deservedly classic, and when you dive beneath their surface, there is much more there than meets the eye. Tangled Up in Blue is the prime example of that. At face value, it appears to be a Shaggy Dog story about a tumultuous on-again, off-again love affair. But when you really look at its lyrics and the way that the lyrics are sequenced, you see that it changes geographic location, it changes temporal location, very non-linearly, sort of at a whim. The pronouns in the song suggest that it's about the same pair, but the time and space shifts indicate that it might be about as many different pairs as there are verses. Or it could be some sort of past lives narrative. There is more artistically to chew on than just Shaggy Dog love story. The only other one I want to single out is Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts because it is as good an epic song, in my opinion, as he has. To me, it is an absurdist western with a beginning, middle, and end. Unlike Idiot Wind, Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts is a good foil to it because it is long and epic, but it is not surrealist. It's a song that should be made into a miniseries. I think people have tried and failed, but filmmakers, keep trying. It squares with my philosophy of what a great album is. It is great front to back and has no dull moments. I would put it, therefore, just behind Highway 61 Revisited in the S tier. 16. The Basement Tapes. Yes, I know this was recorded in 1967, but, my friends, it was released in 1975, and I think that's significant in the way that we interpret it. It harkens to an aesthetic that heretofore was not really represented in his official studio albums. It is even more surreal, even more absurdist than the most absurdist stuff on Blonde on Blonde. It is less instrumentally fleshed out, but that does not hurt it. If anything, that helps it. As a singer-songwriter and a performing musician, there is something so instructive about this album to me. Its simplest, least fleshed out songs show you the bare minimum requirement for creating an excellent song. The case in point to me is Apple Suckling Tree. Apple Suckling Tree is a song that I look forward to listening to, and it's a song with no official verse lyrics. Dylan's website will tell you differently, but clearly the only thing that they had was that chorus, and then Dylan was just singing some dummy lyrics. What that tells me is that the bare minimum essence of an excellent song is a mood. What distinguishes Dylan is that he has both the mood and he can write poetry with the best of them. But this album should teach all of us that mood is the minimum requirement of greatness, at least in rock and roll. A lot of these songs are among my favorite Bob Dylan songs. Going to Acapulco is one I play all the time. Tears of Rage. I just love the funny ones too. $1 Million Bash, Yay Heavy, and A Bottle of Bread. I don't adore the band songs on this album. The band songs are not bad, but neither are they among the 20th century's most provocative poetry, and that's what they're up against in the Dylan tracks. I adore this album. I find the mood irresistible. I find it hilarious. It's just a room you want to hang out in. I put this above Blood on the Tracks in his S tier. 17. Desire. This is an album that many regard as a Dylan classic that I do not. Something that sticks in my craw about this album is that all of these songs are co-written, and so it's hard for me to know what Dylan did and did not do. Yes, it has some monumentally terrific songs. Hurricane is one of them, but I will say Hurricane is not a Dylan song that I go back to very often. Isis is a song I go back to a lot. Romance in Durango is a song I go back to a lot. Black Diamond Bay is not talked about enough as a great, funny Bob Dylan epic. Probably the reason for that is it's such a complex story with so many characters, some of whom have such ridiculous monikers. And maybe the fact that he never played it live, with the exception of the rumored Salt Lake City show that has never arrived on a bootleg. The problem, though, is that there's just an artistic misguidedness on this album to me, the crown jewel of which is Joey. Joey is a fully wrong-headed song about a murderous psychopath. Joey Gallo was not the pretty boy Floyd, steal from the rich and give to the poor guy that Bob Dylan is claiming he is on this song. The song is so wrong-headed that I wonder if Dylan didn't get on the wrong side of some guy in the mafia and they told him, hey, write a song about our boy or else we'll cut all the strings off your guitars or something. Sarah, in its way, is also an ugly song. The circumstances of that relationship call into question some of the more amorous claims in that song. I guess I kind of like the mood in One More Cup of Coffee, but not that much. It just feels like the predecessor of Senior, and Street Legal is an album that I think is such garbage. A lot of these songs are keepers. Most of them sound better live than they do in the studio. I do not dislike this album. I like the offhandedness in the studio arrangements. I like some of the compositions. I love some of the compositions. I hate a few of the compositions. I would put this just north of Nashville Skyline in the B tier. 18, Street Legal. For reasons that I do not comprehend, this is one of the most divisive albums in Bob Dylan's discography. Some people absolutely adore this album. I think this is one of his worst albums. The songs on this album that I think some people classify as poetic, like Changing of the Guard, to me feel like Dylan reaching for a poetics that he used to be able to conjure effortlessly, and that now he can only sort of imitate. Where Are You Tonight is that to me. There is unfortunately some male chauvinist energy on this album. New Pony is that way. Is Your Love in Vain is that way. Even Baby Stop Crying. Ugh, No Time to Think is such a drag. It does have some redeeming traits. We Better Talk This Over is a pretty cool song. True Love Tends to Forget could have been such a nice song. The piano demos of this album are so tender and sweet. And then something happened when he got into the studio because his voice is just like this malicious razor blade. The songs got meaner, baselessly meaner by the time he got into the studio. I do not like this album. I practically never listened to it. I put it just south of his debut album in the C tier. 19, Slow Train Coming. And now we enter into one of the most misrepresented and misunderstood phases of Bob Dylan's career, the gospel phase. The context here, as Dylan explains it, is that he was in a hotel room toward the end of his world year-long 1978 tour and felt visited by Christ. It's not hard to believe that he would have had an experience like that. He had just come to the end of an extremely long and grueling tour, an extremely grueling period in his personal life. I'm sure that the rock star thing was not doing everything it needed to do for his spirit. He needed something to hang on to. I love a lot of these songs. Gotta Serve Somebody is almost like Rainy Day Women. The song has more to it than meets the eye. It's not necessarily saying you have to be a Christian. It's just saying that no matter where you are in life, you're going to be serving somebody or something else. Man Gave Names to All the Animals, from the reggae production to the just children's book lyric to the surprise twist ending. It is serious and dark and goofy as hell, and I just adore it. I listened to this album through the lens of some of the live recordings that I've heard of it over the years, and this album live was unbelievable. Some of his absolute best performances. I Believe in You shines live. If you haven't heard the When He Returns performances from Toronto 1980, they are absolutely sublime. Do I sort of personally believe that the moment Christ returns is going to turn humanity on its head? No, I don't believe that. But do I feel just the artistic necessity of that song coming from him and the sheer vocal performance strength of that song coming from him? Yes. These songs have a lot of virtue. I'd be loath to put it too high in his catalog because I don't think it's a remotely defining Bob Dylan album, but it is a very listenable, very interesting minor album. I put it just behind John Wesley Harding in the B tier. 20, Saved. Oh, Saved. This album is unnecessarily maligned, and I think what most people bristle against is the evangelism of it. What people love about Bob is that he is sort of anti-ideologue. The ideologue in question could be a racist politician, it could be
somebody who wants him to stay in one artistic lane at the expense of all the others. It could be cops who falsely imprison somebody like Hurricane Carter. But generally speaking, his best songs are anti-ideological, I would contend. I think people who fall in love with Bob's music for its anti-ideological quality bristle against this album's ideological stance. I am one of these people to some extent, but I still see a lot of value in this album that people tend to dismiss. For example, I think In the Garden has a tremendous chord progression and sort of an interesting, edgy energy. Saving Grace and Covenant Woman both have interesting music to me. I also admit to being roused sometimes by the rock and roll energy of Solid Rock, or the fast-paced gospel rock of Saved. Another reason I think people compare this unfavorably to Slow Train Coming is Slow Train Coming seemed to have a unique production aesthetic. Mellow gospel rock. I don't know that he invented it, but it had an aesthetic distinctness. A lot of the songs on Saved feel like imitations of a gospel aesthetic that predated Bob. There is a lot musically that's interesting about this album. A couple of its songs are keepers. All you can sort of hope to do is share in the energy of Bob's revelation. It does belong in the lower reaches of his tier list, but it is not so devoid of value that it deserves the unqualified panning that it gets from a lot of critics. I would put it just south of Street Legal in the C tier. 21, Shot of Love. Shot of Love is a little bit like the New Morning of the gospel period. There were a lot of Dylan fans then and a lot of Dylan fans now who see the Christian phase as Bob losing his way. Shot of Love is generally thought of as the album where he begins to find it again. And again, I'm kind of in the middle here. I don't see the gospel period as Bob losing his way, nor do I feel like Shot of Love is him really finding his way again. As is usually the case, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Unlike Saved, Shot of Love has a unique and fresh poetics. Shot of Love, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, Every Grain of Sand. If you listen sort of superficially to the language, it sounds like he's trying to tell you stories about real people he knows or has interacted with. But if you really focus on the lyrics, you realize that it's actually sort of this kaleidoscopic story where details fly in from one angle and fly in from another angle. You may be in the same place as earlier in the verse, you may be in a completely different place from earlier in the verse. When the aesthetic works, as it does in The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, the end result is like looking at a Hieronymus Bosch painting. It's this miasma of interestingly rendered sensory information. It short-circuits my rational mind and puts me into this poetically meditative state that I love to be in. At its best, Shot of Love is the development of this new poetics that Bob would carry through to Infidels, and that I think you could even draw a through line to some of his great later work like Love and Theft. At its worst, though, it's just kind of boring. Trouble, for example, despite some memorable turns of phrase, musically it is the same approach as many of the other harder, bluesier songs on the album, and the overarching sentiment or idea is pretty vapid. There's trouble all over the place. Okay. Property of Jesus, I don't know if I can get behind. There's something sweet and vulnerable about it, but I think it's the vapors of Bob's Christian faith. What's interesting about Shot of Love, it has an emerging poetics that is occasionally crystallized, but mostly still in development, but it's a very pleasurable album. The informality of tracks like Heart of Mine and Watered Down Love is sweet and pleasurable. It's certainly not asking of you what Saved asked of you, which is to deal with Bob's evangelism for 40 minutes or so. I like this album, but I don't think it deserves a place of honor in his discography. I would put it ahead of Street Legal and behind his debut album in the C tier. You should listen to his debut album first, but it has some kind of unique value. 22, Infidels. This is for sure the 1980s Bob album that I've listened to the most. Of all his 80s work, the poetic heights on this one are the highest. I can't say enough about Joker Man. I love everything about it. I would stack it against anything from Bringing It All Back Home in terms of poetry. A Sweetheart Like You, to me, is a poetic investigation into what is kind of a cliche movie line. What's a sweetheart like you doing in a dump like this? What does the asker of that question have in their backstory that makes them qualified to ask that question? And what are they trying to get from somebody who doesn't seem like they belong in this hovel? And what is this hovel? I is a continuation of that poetics that I was talking about in Shot of Love. At first glance, it seems like a story. The more you probe at it, the less it seems like a story, and the more that seemingly simple phrases reveal surprising complexity. The thing that makes this album hard to evaluate is it also has some very bad songs on it. Songs that are not necessarily badly written, but that just to me have never resonated. Neighborhood Bully is one of those. The issue I think with Man of Peace is largely production. It has such unwelcome and unhelpful studio polish. It has like 3 instrumental breaks in the studio take that are all of which are kind of unnecessary. Union Sundown is another one. It seems like he's forcing ideological stances that I'm not always sure I agree with, and I sort of doubt his conviction to some extent. It's also the beginning of him doing this thing he did in the mid-80s, saying girl a lot in the lyrics, doing these little affected laughs on the mic. It just smacks of midlife crisis to me. I suppose midlife crises are inevitable to some extent, but they're also kind of just sad to witness. Infidels has such high poetic heights, and also probably 3 songs that I really don't like listening to out of its 8. I'm actually going to put it just in front of Desire in the B tier. 23, Empire Burlesque. The thing I want to say about Empire Burlesque up top is that it does not suck. Some people may tell you that it sucks, and it doesn't. I would say this album has several songs that are very interestingly written. A song like Tight Connection to My Heart is not powerfully well written, but there is a lot in it that's interesting. They're beating the devil out of a guy wearing a powder blue wig. Sure. When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky, I think, has a lot of power in it, but its power is blunted somewhat by its production and by its structure. It's too long. There's too many instrumental breaks. I would delete a verse. What I don't like about this album are the ballads. In the 80s, I think he developed this way of writing ballads that they feel like token emotional songs. I'll Remember You feels that way to me. Emotionally Yours, Never Gonna Be the Same Again. The reason I find the ostensible emotion in those songs hard to accept is that the writing is sort of stale. The rhymes are stale, the structures are just inherited from pop structures. There's not enough that's inventive about them to make me feel that the emotion is deeply rooted in something inspiring. There is a good helping of interesting writing on this album, there is a good helping of very uninteresting writing to me, and there is just a cherry on top of the Odd Sunday of Dark Eyes, which is a powerfully well-written song. It's not an album that sucks, but it's also not an album that's any more interesting than anything in the B tier. I would put it just above Shot of Love in the C tier. The C tier is turning into albums that are not great in their own right, but that have a lot that's interesting to investigate poetically. If life turns you into a deep Bob fan, these are albums that you ought to at some point hear. 24, Knocked Out Loaded. Before recording this video, I went back and listened through these albums again just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I was so prepared to hate this album, and then I could not get myself to hate it. The crown jewel of this album is Brownsville Girl, which it's the great unknown classic of Bob's catalog. Like, people know Desolation Row, people kind of know It's Alright Ma. Not enough people know Brownsville Girl. It's fascinating. It is peculiar and funny and long, and it just radiates something intoxicating. Bob trying to do the cool guy 80s Bob thing, wearing vests with nothing underneath and long feathery earrings Bob. This is as close as that Bob gets to being credible. Songs that fall into that category include Maybe Someday, Drifting Too Far From Shore, Got My Mind Made Up, Under Your Spell, and You Wanna Ramble. I wouldn't put any of those songs on a playlist for a new Bob Dylan fan, but if you find your way to Under Your Spell, like, you're gonna be glad you did. They Killed Him is a song I really like, and this production is just horrendous. The children's choir, the automatic horns, it's bad, but it's like sweet bad. It's like somebody trying to do you a favor and kind of missing the mark, but you appreciate that they tried. Just to be clear, this is not a tremendously good album, but there is one truly great song on this album, and then of the 7 others, there are 4 or 5 entirely listenable songs, and then 2 kind of forgettable ones. It's not a great album, but it has the decency not to waste too much of your time. It's high C tier Bob to me. 25, Down in the Groove. If Shot of Love is the 1980s New Morning, this is definitely its self-portrait. It's a hodgepodge of covers and originals, some of which he wrote by himself, some of which he co-wrote. There are many who will and have disagreed with me, but the covers don't have that spark of magic that he is so capable of bringing to covers. I think it's partly because he's choosing songs that don't really suit his unique artistic capabilities. Let's Stick Together just doesn't really suit them. If you're gonna cover a song, you want to bring something essential to it. There's nothing enduring about his arrangement of that, or his arrangement of When Did You Leave Heaven, or Sally Sue Brown. The only covers on this album, to me, that have anything essential about them are Rank Strangers to Me and Shenandoah. Shenandoah, it's not quite a great arrangement, but it has something. It's unique in the way that he's playing it. There's a unique energy he brings to it. The take they captured is like not the full realization of that energy, but it's got something. Rank Strangers to Me I would describe almost identically. Listening to this album is a very peculiar experience. You would be well advised to take the couple of good songs on this album and then kind of chuck the rest of it. Unless I'm required to render another opinion on it for some reason, I don't think I'm gonna listen to it again. I would put this behind Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in the D tier. 26, Oh Mercy. As a Bob fan, you find yourself waiting for these moments where it sounds like he's really invested. A lot of the time, both in the studio and live, it doesn't sound like he cares. So then the albums or the shows where it seems like he's been struck by some spontaneous bolt of inspiration, fans tend to glom onto. I think the reason why people tend to like this album is because it sounds like Bob gives a shit. In a lot of cases on this album, the plaudits that it tends to get are warranted. Ring Them Bells is a terrific song. Shooting Star is a terrific song. This is not my favorite version of most of the time, but it's a very tender composition. Where Teardrops Fall feels a little half-baked to me, but it has something. However, the fact that it seems like Bob gives a shit tempts people to overrate a lot of these songs. Political World, for example. First of all, the phrase "we live in a political world," I don't think it has any meaning. It's like the meme, the "we live in a society" meme. Put Political World up against Leonard Cohen's song from a similar time period, The Future. The Future is similarly cynical about human nature, but it has a lot more poetic credibility, in my view. Everything Is Broken, likewise. It's this sort of weird, like, broad brush statement, de facto cynicism that I don't totally agree with. Man in the Long Black Coat is sort of a shell of an outlaw song. Oh Mercy is interesting. There are some really terrific songs, some songs that are entirely good, and some songs that I consider half-baked and that I think people overrate because it sounds like Bob himself is invested. Yeah, I would put this in the very low B tier. Forward, the grand reshuffling. The last thing I want to do before I get into the 1990s is a little bit of a reshuffling. The main one that I want to do is put The Times They Are A-Changin' and John Wesley Harding in the A tier. Ultimately, I have to accept that The Times They Are A-Changin' has a slew of classic songs on it. And I will say, John Wesley Harding in the comment section of its video got a disproportionate amount of love for its stripped minimalistic poetics. It forced me to reconsider. The only other change I want to make is moving Shot of Love from that point in the C tier to this point in the C tier. The fact of the matter is I've listened to Shot of Love much more than I've listened to those other two, and in addition to that, I just think its songs are better. It's this nice valley between him doing the intense gospel thing and then him doing the intense I'm a 1980s rock star thing, which, no you're not. Not such a grand reshuffling, but a slight reshuffling. Now, okay, fine, finally, the 1990s. 27, Under the Red Sky. This album is kind of a guilty pleasure for me. Let's just look at Wiggle Wiggle a little bit. Time magazine named it one of his worst songs. Q put it on a list of 10 terrible records by great artists. I just don't hate Wiggle Wiggle. It is a nursery rhyme, but it's true to nursery rhyme history in the sense that it is both very playful and very dark. Wiggle till you vomit fire. That's not the only instance of shockingly dark imagery in Wiggle Wiggle. Wiggle Wiggle is not the only song that has that kind of twisted fairy tale vibe to it. Under the Red Sky also does. 10,000 Men feels that way to me. 2 by 2. Handy Dandy. I honestly think that Handy Dandy is a better outlaw song than Man in the Long Black Coat from Oh Mercy. But the music in Handy Dandy is just bonkers. It feels like La Bamba. Another reason why people don't like this album is because his voice has undergone yet another level of deterioration that I'm sure nobody thought possible. Not only does it sound very ragged, it sounds like he's just waking up from a nap, and like he's surprised to find himself behind a microphone in a recording studio. For some people, this record is a bridge too far, vocally speaking. But for me, it's not. In terms of his minor albums, and evidence of a specifically Dylan-esque poetics that's not trying to be anything other than that, this is a better example of it than you want to think it is. This will probably be an unpopular ranking, but I would rank this just behind Shot of Love in his C tier. 28, Good As I've Been To You, and 29, World Gone Wrong. Good As I've Been To You and World Gone Wrong are two of the Dylan albums that I've listened to the most. And not like a lot, but the most. It's specifically because I, too,
perform solo a lot. It is incredibly important to me personally that I can present songs in a solo setting and still have the performances be engrossing. To me, these two albums are masterclasses in how to perform well alone. Both Good As I've Been To You and World Gone Wrong are albums of folk covers. There are no original songs on either of these albums. To me, these albums are what Self-Portrait isn't. In a lot of cases, Self-Portrait is Bob intentionally or unintentionally desecrating the songs that he's covering. It's not like these albums are polished or precise in any kind of way, but they feel like him honoring the material that made him. His guitar playing is both off the cuff and detailed. To me, there's a philosophy embedded in that the best music happens in a moment and is unplanned, and doesn't necessarily depend on excellent technical prowess, although he is a very skilled guitar player. It just depends on connection to the song's spirit and to the spirit of the performance. This, to me, is what folk sounds like. Folk does not sound like the Avett Brothers to me. And neither, by the way, does folk sound like some of the more totemic folk artists from the 1960s. Folk, to me, does not sound studious. It doesn't sound polished. It sounds to me like ragged people playing songs about other ragged people. Maybe those people are themselves, or are some kind of beatified outlaw, or some kind of fiendish outlaw who deserves a sort of public crucifixion in the form of a song written about all the horrible things they did. If you're not a performing singer-songwriter, you might get less out of these albums, because you may or may not be interested in the finer points of his guitar playing, or why he sings one line with more gravel in his voice, or extending certain vowels, or commingling the vocal melody with a lick on the guitar. Those things may be less interesting to you, but to me, each one is just a little lesson in the overarching masterclass on how to perform alone. They deserve to be in the lower parts of Bob Dylan's A tier, and that's just the way it is. Them that don't like it can leave me alone. Or comment, or leave a comment. 30, Time Out of Mind. At the time of its release, Time Out of Mind was treated as yet another comeback album. I don't think there's an artist in the world, in any genre, who has had more comeback works than Bob Dylan. It was his first universally or near universally praised album, probably since, I don't know, Blood on the Tracks or something. He's back working with super producer Daniel Lanois. The sound on this album is largely attributable to Daniel Lanois, although Bob unquestionably had some editorial power in developing that sound as well. There are several songs on this album that I consider excellent. I do consider Lovesick to be an excellent song. I consider Cold Iron's Bound to be an excellent song. And I consider Highlands to be an excellent song. The issue I have with this album is similar to the issue that I have with The Times They're a Changin'. The songs are just so negative. A lot of them sound like the notes you write before you step out onto the ledge. Not dark yet, trying to get to heaven, standing in the doorway. It's so monochromatically negative that I kind of sicken of it after a little while. Having said that, I think what you can say about the songs on this album is that they are all written and rendered, that is, performed with care. If nothing else, they all sound good. I don't think that this collection of songs, just purely looking at the songs, is nearly as strong as Love and Theft or even Modern Times, but it's an album with a pronounced and thematically appropriate mood, which is more than you can say for a lot of his other albums, and it has several songs that are excellent and many songs that are fair to good. I think it deserves a place of honor, in part because of what it represents in the ongoing narrative of Bob's recording career, but I don't listen to this as much as my favorite Bob Dylan albums. I would put it in the very last place of his A tier. 31, Love and Theft. It's true that Bob Dylan produced most of his best work when he was a very young man. He's alluded to this in certain interviews, that as a younger man, he wrote incredible songs almost effortlessly. The older he got, the more he had to fight for excellence. It's a good lesson for creatives, because the older you get, the more you have to fight for what used to come naturally to you. Or as Leonard Cohen put it, I ache in the places where I used to play. Dylan is no exception to that. He is just a man. He continued to fight for it. He continued digging. And every so often he came up with the most fantastic treasure. And Love and Theft is a prime example of that. In Love and Theft, Dylan discovers yet another fresh and unprecedented songwriting poetics. I think you could argue that he began to discover it on Time Out of Mind, but in my listening, Time Out of Mind is the seed of that poetics, and Love and Theft is the fully bloomed plant. It's this melange of imagery that comes from an array of innumerable sources, which include Mark Twain, Charlie Patton, the biography of a Japanese Yakuza boss, Lewis Carroll, the Carter family, the Bible, of course. It feels Faulknerian to me in that it seems like Bob is writing from the subconscious of the American South in the 1930s, and yet also clearly from a modern person's point of view. In there being collages of imagery and influences and references, they seem like these postmodern renderings of the subconscious of the American South in the 1930s. Is what I'm going with. I only feel compelled to dig for that kind of term because I am so charmed and intrigued by the lyrics on this album. It fills me with such an appetite to discover and understand their source, where the lifeblood of this album is coming from. This really shows you, in a sense, what popular songwriting could be and what it so rarely is. Most popular songwriters just don't have this kind of ambition. Tweedledee and Tweedledum is a terrific opener. It's a prime example of how good the guitars on this album always sound. The guitar playing on this album is just tremendous. So much credit is owed to Larry Campbell and Charlie Sexton. Summer Days just makes me smile. Lonesome Day Blues is as good a blues song as he's ever written. High Water is such a beautifully intense song about apocalypse, but not just social apocalypse, but individual apocalypse. The line I always think of is, "As great as you are, man, you'll never be greater than yourself." You know, as usual, Bob is not writing about one particular setting or event. He's writing from a sensation and then mapping that sensation onto a lot of different earthly circumstances, one of which is being drowned in your own ego. Moonlight is gorgeous. Po' Boy. Po' Boy is the one song from this album that I like to cover. Cry a While just has such wonderful flights of lyrical fancy that are so characteristic of what makes this album's lyrics so seductive and engrossing. Last night across the alley, I heard a banging on the wall. Must have been Doc Pasquale making a 2 a.m. booty call. I mean, just who had booty call on their bingo card for Bob Dylan lyrics? Not I. I could and probably will do a deeper dive into some of these songs at some point, but suffice to say, Bob found himself in such a special poetic place on this album. He suddenly was possessed by the ghost of William Faulkner and did what Faulkner at his best could do, which was render the subconscious of a controversial stage of America with gravitas and levity and verisimilitude. You feel like you're in someone's head and heart from that era. This will probably be a slightly controversial ranking, but I'm going to put it just above Bringing It All Back Home in the S tier. Yeah, that's how I feel. 32, Modern Times. A good way to situate how I feel about Modern Times relative to its predecessor, Love and Theft, is how I feel about Blonde on Blonde compared to Highway 61 Revisited. In Highway 61 and in Love and Theft, I think Bob crystallized a poetics of popular songwriting that was new under the sun. Obviously, both came from influences which scholars have wasted no shortage of ink in tracing. But in both cases, nobody else was writing popular songs in that way or with such power. And the albums that followed those consummate works are albums that try to do a similar thing slightly less effectively. Not everybody agrees with me that Blonde on Blonde is less effective than Highway 61. Some people do. But that's how I feel about it. But again, we have to put that in perspective. Blonde on Blonde is one of popular music's greatest collections of songs. And I'm sort of splitting hairs of artistic quality when I say that it's less effective than Highway 61, because it's still profoundly effective. And I feel very similarly about Modern Times. It's a slightly dampened rendering of the poetics that he crystallized in Love and Theft. This album is still an excellent work of art. Thunder on the Mountain is another one of his greatest, funniest, most energizing blues songs. Spirit on the Water is also a fascinating song that I can never tell how earnest Spirit on the Water is. It's this love poem of sorts that goes on much longer than you would think a love poem would, and also includes some very dark biblical imagery that seems out of place in a love poem. It's a great example to me of the apparent vibe not necessarily being the essential vibe of the song. When the Deal Goes Down is a song I found very moving when I first discovered this record that over time has worn a little bit thin for me, probably because of lyrics like "we eat and we drink, we feel and we think." Like, yeah, we do, but Working Man's Blues number 2 has some excellent turns of phrase in it. I sleep in the kitchen with my feet in the hall. Sleep is like a temporary death. Nettie Moore feels like a mortality song that doesn't really reference mortality at all. I think it is just the atmosphere of the song that gives it that quality. Also the sense of love receding. Things one has loved receding. Ain't Talkin' is a great spooky song. The other thing that is at least partially a mark against this album and some of the ones that came after it is that in a couple of cases, Bob is literally just rewriting blues standards. Rowan and Tumblin', Someday Baby, The Levee's Gonna Break. These are just blues songs that already existed. And yet writing credit is given to and exclusively to Bob Dylan. And that feels a little bit bad. And I think, it's not that he didn't write a good new set of lyrics, or that I think that, takes the songs out of the running for being good works of art. But it's like how I feel about some of the blues songs on Blonde on Blonde. The fact that there is elsewhere on this album such singular originality makes me look at those songs as just slightly lesser. They feel like romps that are part of a lineage, but not necessarily original outgrowths of in the Bob Dylan garden. I am admittedly about half the age that Dylan was when he recorded this. I'd be curious to hear what people older than I am think of this statement. This album feels very much like what it is like to be somebody over the age of 60. Like that there is more to reflect on than could possibly fit into a 3.5-minute pop song. Or that there is a horizon stretching out ahead of you that you will be beyond sooner or later. You're both reassuring yourself and scaring yourself about what might be past it. The ghosts of one's own history and one's own country's history and one's own music genre's history are so numerous and so present that they all show up in what one thinks and writes. Am I on the right track? It is again a work of popular songwriting art, one that I have not tired of listening to despite dozens and dozens of listens. I don't feel as unabashedly enthusiastic about this as I do about Love and Theft, but I like it very much. I would put it just above John Wesley Harding in the A tier. 33, Together Through Life. At last, the first Dylan album that I bought when it was released. It feels like a lot of these songs were written either quickly or by accident. I don't know if that's true, but that's how it sounds, and to some extent your first impression of the album does guide the way you analyze it. If Love and Theft in modern times are like black tie galas where the host has pulled out all the stops, Together Through Life is a little bit like your friend dropping over for a cup of coffee. It's very nice, and you wouldn't have wanted it to have not happened, but it's not the kind of robust beginning, middle, end, new under the sun experience that those other two albums are. Which isn't to say that it doesn't have some really nice highlights. Beyond Here Lies Nothing is quite a good song. Every time I've seen him sing Beyond Here Lies Nothing live, I've been happy that it's happening. Life is Hard is one of Dylan's more musically rich, good songs. Jolene is a good blues song. Other than that, I find most of the songs on this album charming but forgettable. I find the music in If You Ever Go to Houston pretty plodding. Forgetful Heart feels like some of Oh Mercy's weaker material, where it's like, I get what you're saying, but I don't see a lot of depth in what you're saying. Not that somebody who loves you forgetting who you are isn't a deeply moving experience. I just don't find this to be a deeply moving depiction of that experience. The record is charming. It sounds very good for the most part. 2 or 3 of the songs, I'm always happy when I hear them. It's worth mentioning that all these songs were co-written by Bob Dylan and Robert Hunter, who was the Grateful Dead's lyricist. It's almost how I feel about Desire, where it feels like Dylan adjacent. It feels like a sideshow in the Dylan Carnival. I neither hate it nor consider it as offensive as some of his worst albums. I would put it just south of Under the Red Sky in the C tier. 34, Christmas in the Heart. The year 2009 was full of surprises for Bob fans. Together Through Life was a surprise. It was announced only a month before it was released. This album, too, was a surprise. I did rank this album in my Christmas special in late December, but I do want to put it somewhere in the context of his tier list. The point I made in the Christmas video was most of Bob's career feels like he's holding his audience at arm's length, especially like bringing it all back home and after. There's this growing antipathy toward his audience where his audience wants something specific from him. He doesn't want to give them that specific thing. He wants to keep growing and changing. And the dynamic becomes Bob saying, I'm not going to do what you want me to do, but I'm still going to try to create great art. Those have kind of been the terms of engagement for Bob Dylan and Bob Dylan fans throughout his career. If other Dylan albums are him trying to keep you at arm's length, this is Bob inviting you into his living room for mulled wine and gingerbread men. It's a little bit like how you think of We Are the World. The motive for its creation was to generate money for a charitable purpose, not to vaunt its maker as an artistic genius. Through that lens, I consider it a very charming album. It's just funny on some level to hear late career Bob sing Christmas songs. It's sort of charming fish out of water vibes. This is certainly not a defining Christmas album, which again, I don't necessarily think he was even trying for it to be. But it is mostly very sweet and has a few songs that really suit his voice and his predilection for exhuming musical styles of the past. I'll Be Home for Christmas falls into that category. Must Be Santa falls into that category. Little Drummer Boy, I think he does a nice rendition of. Yeah, I mean, his voice is not well suited to all these songs, but it always feels like a sweet holiday gesture. So I would put it just above Saved in his C tier. 35, Tempest. Since roughly the beginning of the Neverending Tour, Bob's voice has undergone a lot of deterioration. This is what it sounded like in 1988. That's the herd of Arab, he was stuck on a whale. And this is what it sounded like in 2012. Well, I travel to East Texas. When I say deterioration, I don't necessarily mean that it's gotten worse. That's not how I think of voices being good and bad. I just mean that if you took an image of his vocal cords, it probably wouldn't be the anatomical paragon. This has been the case for his entire career. He's always had an unconventional voice. When he's at his best, he finds a way to make it thematically appropriate. And when he's at his worst, he doesn't. Self-Portrait, for example, has many instances of him utilizing his voice the wrong way. Bob Dylan is not a Blue Moon singer. I'm sorry. Love and Theft is a great example of the opposite. His voice suits those songs so well. It makes those songs sound like songs of experience. And so we come to the matter of Tempest. As I was listening to this recently, it occurred to me that when I don't like this album, it's often because Bob is singing against his voice. Against and not with the constraints that his unconventional vocal cords impose. I really like Duquesne Whistle, but it is a really good example of what I'm talking about. The vocal feels strangled. The contents of the song, musical and lyrical, don't seem to ask for or demand that strangulation. A number of other songs on this album fall into that category. Narrow Way, Pay in Blood, Tin Angel, Tempest, Roll On John. There are a handful of songs on this album that I think are very good. I think if you had to keep just one, I would keep Long and Wasted Years. The structure of the verses in that song is very intriguing. The lyric is great. It's the emotion feels real. It has a kind of melodramatic quality, a melodrama of a failed relationship. But it also feels undercut with this ragged authenticity, which probably comes from the fact that Dylan is capable of writing lyrics that feel both, conventionally melodramatic and that are shot through with the poetics that only he is capable of conjuring. Two trains running side by side, 40 miles wide. Like, you're not getting that in Hall & Oates. Soon After Midnight is a good song. The thing that sort of bugs me about Soon After Midnight is Dylan has this thing that he does in these love songs where he just introduces murder. I think it's a craft device to make what would otherwise be a not that interesting song feel like it's got an undercurrent of interesting violence. He also does that in Spirit in the Water. I Can't Go to Paradise No More, I Killed a Man Back There. In this one, it's Two Time and Slim, whoever heard of him, I'll drag his corpse through the mud. Identifying that it's a device that is reused makes me question its necessity in the context of this song. Still a good song, though. Early Roman Kings is like somehow the key to this album. I was listening to it on the train upstate and looking out over sort of barren hills, and also reading a novel about the early days of Western expansion. It was a perfect storm of imagery because there's a line in early Roman kings about them coming over the mountain. There was just this moment where I could sort of see the early Roman kings in the song as just the forces of greed and appetite and covetousness that led to Western expansion. Suddenly I felt like I was watching like a Scorsese, Goodfellas type movie, not about mafiosos, but about Lewis and Clark, or about Daniel Boone, or some kind of early Western expansionist who is sort of morally dubious and who lived a life of violence that, whether we like it or not, is the foundation of the life many US Americans are living today. It's possible that I was doing most of the work there, but it is a testament, I think, to the writing of that song. If the imagery weren't there, and if the imagery didn't resonate, I wouldn't have had that thought process, I don't think. Unfortunately, there are a bunch of songs here that I do not look forward to listening to. Narrow Way is not and will never be Honest With Me, the song from Love and Theft. I feel like Pay in Blood would have been a better song if he'd sung it and produced it the way he produced the material on Rough and Rowdy Ways. If it were subtler, quieter, the major key energy of the song just does not make sense to me. Scarlet Town is interesting because it's not the first time that he took a lyric from an old folk song and made it the refrain of his song. In Scarlet Town, Where I Was Born comes from Barbara Allen, which he covered a bunch throughout his career. It has some memorable turns of phrase, but as a whole, it just doesn't go anywhere. Tin Angel kind of has the opposite problem, where I think it's actually quite a well-written song, but the music is kind of non-existent. Tempest, I just can't listen to. It's both too long and it's kind of dumb. The vocal melody just does not suit his voice. We do not need you to mention Leonardo DiCaprio. It's not a fresh or necessary reflection on the Titanic. If a long and epic song doesn't really deliver, it's just 14 minutes of being kind of bummed out. Yeah, and then Roll On John too, I'm just not that high on. Bob does this. He writes tribute songs to people who died decades and decades and decades after they died. It just makes you sort of wonder about the emotion, whether the emotional catalyst is as strong as the song claims it is. I'm not that high on Tempest as an album. I don't hate listening to it. There are some songs that I really like. Some songs that I don't like as much, but that I do like some of the lyrics in. And then some songs that I find kind of repellent. I would put it just below Shot of Love in the C tier. 36, Shadows in the Night. And so we commence the Sinatra years. Nobody, including me, saw this coming. When this was announced and the singles came out, I was pretty pleasantly surprised. By nature, Bob is not the most gifted crooner. The first single that came out was Full Moon and Empty Arms. And listening to it, I was like, okay, he has something to bring this material. His voice is beleaguered, but he's singing with it this time, not against it. The productions are so quiet and private and intimate. And of course, the playing is tremendous. I remember listening to Full Moon and Empty Arms a few times and thinking to myself, like, yes, he's kind of sliding around the notes a little bit. This is not in the slot the way it would be for somebody like Sinatra, but he's got something to bring this. This whole album pretty much feels that way to me. Many of these songs are decent entries in the Bob Dylan cover canon. On a personal note, I saw Dylan in 2014, Thanksgiving 2014. My grandmother had just died, and he closed the show with Stay With Me. I sobbed. And that's unusual for me at all, let alone in a public setting. I have a very emotional association with that song, and I think with the material from this album more broadly as a result of that. But trying to be objective, like, nobody should mistake this for a classic Dylan album. But if this were his only Great American Songbook covers album, it would be a sort of fond curiosity in his late career work. And yeah, like, why don't we just pretend that's what it is? With that optimistic comment in mind, I'll put it just above Knocked Out Loaded in the C tier. C tier's getting crowded. 37, Fallen Angels. So then in 2016, another one came out. And I remember just being kind of disappointed. Whatever creative point he was trying to make, he made on Shadows in the Night. It showed us his love of the Great American Songbook. It also showed an ability to sing more melodically than a lot of people give him credit for. No, he does not nail every performance and hit every note in the way that a true crooner would. but he does a hell of a lot better than I think anybody would have given him credit for. On the levels of musical arrangement and vocal performance, this album is no worse than Shadows in the Night. The problem is it's also no different than Shadows in the Night. It's 12 more. Unlike those early 90s folk albums, which I think are profound musical statements, these albums are a little bit more like his paintings. He's venturing into territory outside the bounds of his most powerful artistic gift, and doing a commendable but not excellent job. If this were the only American songbook album from this period, I would put it where I put Shadows in the Night. The fact that it was sort of a disappointing entry in his studio discography earns it a slightly lower place for me. I think I put it just above Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in the D tier. 38, Triplicate. Oh god. I mean, whatever creative point Dylan was trying to make by covering these songs in the first place, he made on Shadows in the Night. He made the point, I got the point. He reiterated it on Fallen Angels without really developing it. If a point made and remade is a dead horse, as people like to say, he really took a baseball bat to it on Triplicate. I'm sorry, folks. This is such an unnecessary album. You know, unfortunately, it feels like Self-Portrait to me. I don't think it's the same level of intentional desecration that Self-Portrait is, but it is definitely unintentional desecration, if not. It's like when you're talking to someone and they're making an argument and you get it, and then they keep talking and you get it and you're bored, and then they keep talking for 2 more hours. The problem, again, is that crooning is just not his bread and butter. It's like his paintings. I remember finding myself in a gallery in London without realizing to stumbling into a Bob Dylan exhibit of paintings and thinking to myself, like, this is interesting. It does give you a window into why he writes the way he does. But in and of themselves, they're not great paintings. It's the same thing with these songs, you know. It's interesting, it gives you a window into why he creates the kind of material he creates. But in and of themselves, these are not great takes of these songs. Okay, you know, the fact that there were 10 or 11 on Shadows in the Night, okay. The fact that there were 12 more on Fallen Angels, okay. And then the fact that there are 30 more on Triplicate, like, no, I'm sorry, no. I'm changing the channel. I must emphasize this. I love Bob Dylan. He's my favorite artist. And sometimes he makes a choice that I just could not disagree with more. And this is one. Whereas Self-Portrait has a few really good moments, this one is just wholly unnecessary to me. This is my least favorite Bob Dylan album. I didn't even realize that was the case, but it is. I'm gonna put it just south of Self-Portrait in the F tier. 39, Rough and Rowdy Ways. So let's return to this point. Some late career Dylan albums are him singing against his voice, others are him singing with his voice. I am delighted to say that this is a great example of the latter. If it took 5 albums worth of great American songbook material for him to get to that creative place, fine. This is his first album of original songs after receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature. That happened in 2016. The world of literature was very divided over whether it should have happened. I pretty much agree with Leonard Cohen, who, when asked whether Dylan deserved the Nobel Prize, said that giving Dylan the Nobel Prize was like pinning a medal on Mount Everest for being the tallest mountain. In other words, duh. The reason I bring that up is because this album is riddled with literary allusions, where in the past he sort of favored folk song allusions. I Contain Multitudes, Whitman, Mother of Muses, The Odyssey, Murder Most Foul, Shakespeare. My own version of You is very Frankensteinish. Not that making literary references makes a song good, but it's just that seems to be the genetic material of these songs. Overall, these songs are written very well and sound very good. I Contain Multitudes is a good opener because, you know, it's an interesting lyric and it's a fresh production setting for a Bob Dylan original. And it's very similar to the production setting in the Sinatra stuff. Quiet, intimate, very malleable tempo. It's a feeling of come close, there's something I need to tell you, and then you're glad you did. False Prophet is a great lyric. The sort of old blues referencing playing on this album is really good too. Like, it was a lot more filled out on Love and Theft. It was busier and it was a gumbo with more and more spicy ingredients. It's generally sparser on this album, and that's a good thing. Whereas in Tempest, I think he was trying to replicate the heights he reached musically and lyrically on Love and Theft with mixed results. Here he finds a new place to go to. The playing is sparser, it's a little more ragtag. It's closer to what I think blues bands really sounded like back then. Grimier, grittier, less virtuosic, more soulful. False Prophet, Goodbye Jimmy Reed, and Crossing the Rubicon all are that. The only song on this album that I don't like is Murder Most Foul. And he at least had the decency to make that the last song. I do dislike it holistically, but I don't dislike everything in it. Once it gets to the part that he's making requests of Wolfman Jack, who is a real radio DJ. Once it gets to that point, it picks up a lot of steam, and I get it. You know, I get what he's saying, that JFK's assassination unleashed a torrent of torrid musical composition and performance that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. I get that, and I agree with it. I think he's making a good point. But it takes him a long time to get there, and there are a lot of lyrics in the song that I just think aren't that good, that are kind of insensitive. President Kennedy was riding high, good day to be living and a good day to die. Like, who's that for? Who is saying that? Whose perspective is that from? And what is the sentiment? It just doesn't resonate with me. A lot of the rest of the lyrics in the song do, but there's a lot that don't. And I would say that's a theme on this album. When this album is not good, it's because its songs have too many lyrics. My Own Version of You is another good example. I don't play cards and I don't shoot no dice. Like, there's just moments in it that don't feel connected to what's thematically powerful in the song. And nobody had the guts to tell Dylan, hey, maybe you could delete that verse. Just like nobody had the guts to tell Herman Melville, this doesn't need to be this long. Yeah, I Contain Multitudes has a couple moments like that. I'm just like Anne Frank. Are ya? Like, there's a sympathetic take on that line that Anne Frank was really at the edge, at a bleeding edge of being a human. I mean, death around the corner every moment of the day. I mean, but so then I say, but like, are you really that way? Is that, I mean, maybe somewhere in your soul you feel darkness ever present, but not Nazis literally ever present. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not, like, that's a line I'm not sure I can get behind. And there are moments of that on most of the songs on this album. Most of the songs on the whole are really good lyrics with really good music, which I guess makes them really good songs. But then there are just these moments of, you could have used an editor. There's a lot of moments of that. The last thing is that there are some very moving, genuinely, earnestly moving moments on this album. I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You as one of those. I've always interpreted the you character in that song not to be a love interest, but his audience. You know, for almost 40 years, he's been on the road playing his music for his audience. Mother of Muses, I think, is an earnest paean to his muse. I think it's a moment of reflection on the concurrent timelines of his life and America's life. It goes to World War II generals, and Dylan was born before the end of World War II. And then he draws a through line, both in that song and in Murder Most Foul, from that through America's other crowning creative and moral achievements. Whenever a person who is old does anything creative, everybody interprets it as, oh, this is his mortality album or painting or whatever. But, you know, I'm sorry, he's over the age of 80. He can't not be he can't not be reflecting. Some of these songs are beautiful, earnest reflections. Key West is a song that I find just deliciously irascible. Key West is the linguistic equivalent of walking through a very humid, buggy, swampy atmosphere in Florida. And I have enough Jewish relatives that I've done that. There are some very clear marks against it to me. Murder Most Foul is the big one, and a general need for a pruning. Most of these songs need a little bit of a pruning, but I only feel that way because I like them so much. Yeah, I would put Rough and Rowdy Ways just below John Wesley Harding in the A tier. 40, Shadow Kingdom. This was a commercial thing. For those of you who don't know what this is, this COVID-era streaming platform named Veep, or Veeps, hired him to do this virtual concert that would only be streamable for like 2 days. You know, certain intervals over 2 days, and then would be gone. So you had to pay $60 to watch it. And I did, thinking what they were saying was honest. Never trust music business people. Yeah, it's not. You can still watch it. And then they, of course, released an album of the songs that he recorded for it. There's not really an artistic thrust here. There are a few moments that are artistically striking here. The new lyrics to Be Alone With You are, and then the rearrangement of When I Paint My Masterpiece is another one. Seeing Bob play When I Paint My Masterpiece live in the last several years has been a highlight of the shows. All of his rearrangements are interesting, not all of them are good. This one is good. Yeah, and the video was cool. There was a creative concern in the video. The concert video kind of felt like a David Lynch movie. May he rest in peace. It had this eerie, surreal Western setting that at its best was cool and interesting. This was not purely a cash grab. There were some creative experiments and successes on this album, but it's not really worth your time. If this album were expunged from his canon and from history, I would not shed a tear. If you're curious to know what it's like to go to a contemporary Bob Dylan concert, this might be interesting, but if not, you can fully skip it. The albums in his F tier offend me. This album does not offend me. Yeah, I would put it in the very last slot of his D tier. Epilogue, the last reshuffling. The last thing before we reflect here is just one last reshuffling. Yeah, Street Legal and Saved are going in the D tier. I know that hurts people's feelings. I know people love Street Legal. I'm not saying you can't love it. You can. I encourage you to love whatever and whomever you love. I do. I made this point in the 70s video, but he just sounds like an on that album. I just don't find the poetry all that good. When Bob Dylan is great is when he is striving for a new poetics. Changing of the Guards and Where Are You Tonight feel like him reaching back for a poetics that he had earlier in his career. You know, don't look back. Didn't he say that? I'm not interested in Bob trying to recreate a poetics that he already mastered. I'm just not. It's like the first time he sounds like an aging legend. And the question embedded in it, to me, is he going to do this gracefully or not? This album really brought that into question. Saved is kind of how I feel about Fallen Angels, where it's like, yeah, Slow Train Coming made the point. It made the point pretty well, and Saved makes the same point less interestingly. Musically, lyrically, everything. Yeah, this is my Bob Dylan studio album tier list. A couple reflections on this. I wrote this in my January newsletter, and I've said this in the comments and elsewhere repeatedly, but the reason I'm doing this is not because I want to try to make objective and unassailable judgments about how good these albums are, but rather because I want to flesh out my own taste. Why do I hold an album like The Basement Tapes in such high regard when many people don't? Why do I hold Street Legal in such low regard when so many people love it? Why do I respond so intensely to albums that most people don't even know, like Good As I've Been To You and World Gone Wrong? Going through these albums like this has forced me to give voice to impressions that I've never verbalized before. What has occurred to me is that almost more than a fan of music, I'm a fan of poetry. I am a fan of a fresh and unprecedented and crystallized poetics. Dylan has done that a handful of times in his career. In the context of art making in general, I don't know how many artists you can say did it 6 times in their career. There are artists like the Rolling Stones who did it once and then kept doing it and doing it and doing it over and over again. There are artists like Leonard Cohen who I think did it 3 times. Yeah, and then there are artists in other genres like Picasso, I think, did it repeatedly throughout his career. You know, an excellent formalist, an excellent surrealist, an excellent cubist. The blue period has its own charms. You know, it's like there are certain artists in history who've done it and done it and done it and done it. And Dylan is one of them. The first true poetic peak was the mid-60s. The trio of albums, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde. That represents the first and probably the highest poetic peak in his career. It's not unintentional that all 3 of those albums are in his S tier. All of them are pointing at that same poetics, that same first excellent poetics. And in my view, Highway 61 does it best, Bringing It All Back Home does it next best, and Blonde on Blonde does it 3rd best out of 3. Yeah, and I don't put any of the folk albums into that category because I think it's still Dylan leaning heavily on a poetics that preceded him, that's not fully fresh and original. Not to say those albums aren't great or that I haven't listened to them to death. I have. The Basement Tapes I consider another poetic peak in the mountain range of Bob Dylan poetic peaks. The Basement Tapes is different from the poetics he was using just the year or 2 before. The Highway 61 poetics is surrealist, and the Basement Tapes poetics is absurdist. That's a Venn diagram with some overlap, but it's also a Venn diagram with some non-overlap. What do you call non-overlap? Divergence? Sure. Blood on the Tracks, I think, does it again. The triumph of Blood on the Tracks is writing songs that, from a distance to the naked eye, look like stories. The more you zoom in, you see this sort of corpus of poetic content that is made up of almost like narrative pointillism, where every verse is its own story, with characters that kind of seem the same, kind of seem different. Each of them are fascinating to look at in their own right. It's a little bit like the Mandelbrot. Is that what it's called? It's like a fractal kind of thing, where the more you zoom in, the more you see detail within an overarching body of work that is itself interesting and detailed. It took him a long time to do it again, but Love and Theft is him doing it again. To cite a lyric from Modern Times, I've been conjuring up all these long dead souls from their crumbling tombs. That's what he's doing. Poetically, that's what he's doing. I've phrased it in a very academic way in the 2000s video. What did I say? The postmodern renderings of the subconscious of the American South in the 1930s, I think is what I said. And I stick with that. It's like a past lives channeler, but it feels real. It a little bit feels like what it's like to be in New Orleans, where the festive presence of the dead is so palpable there. And that's how it feels on Love and Theft. What I realize is that's what I love. A clear and fresh and crystallized poetics is what I love. I sort of judge everything in proximity to that. And what I don't love is a sort of pleasant vibe. I don't dislike that, but I don't love that. The perfect example for me is Nashville Skyline. Nashville Skyline is a wonderful gesture, but it is not a towering poetic accomplishment. Again, I don't begrudge anybody their love of the value that Nashville Skyline has to offer, because it has it, but it's not what I love. It's also not what I hate, but it's not what I love. The other thing I don't love is one-dimensional ideological statements. Infidels has a few of those. The Christian stuff all is that, more or less. I don't go to writing for ideology. Not that ideology has no place in my life or in human life in general, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a connection to the spirit world, and I don't believe that the spirit world is an ideological world. That's where we and the stuff of existence transcends the crassness and necessary evil of ideology. That's what I want to feel connected to when I interact with art. I don't want to feel connected to ideology. I just don't. It's not interesting to me. It doesn't solve my suffering. Ideology does not solve and soothe my suffering. The other thing that I don't love is a master in one domain experimenting in a different domain. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I'm not saying I haven't gotten some things out of the albums in Bob's catalog that fall into that category. I have. But it's not what I love. I feel like I'm trying to convince somebody non-existent of these things. But it's not what stimulates me the most artistically. It's interesting to me. I like it. As somebody who is himself a songwriter and a performer and who wants to do as good a job as he can, it's interesting to me to see how a master came to be. Those albums are good indications in a lot of cases of how the master Bob Dylan came to be. In and of themselves, they are not masterful artistic statements. Yeah, all the Sinatra stuff, the instrumental stuff on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. If I want to listen to Americana bluegrass, I'm gonna listen to Doc Watson. You know, I'm not gonna listen to Bob Dylan. And the beautiful thing is, your tier list will look different from mine. It should. We're different. We're different. We're up to different things in life. You know, we have different needs from an artistic perspective. The beauty of a catalog like Bob's is that it can be radically different. This is what I love about art. There is no single right answer. That's what I adore about art. There is no single right answer. It's the jumping off point for intrigue, for discussion, for, you know, dynamism between two different people, between two strangers, two friends, two lovers. It's a jumping off point for dynamism and energy. And so the difference between my opinion and your opinion is where the value is where the profundity of the work is evident. This is my Bob Dylan tier list. All of which is to say, this has been a really illuminating process for me. Practically none of this was new to me. The only new things were just subtle nuances in what I thought or little details that I hadn't really given credit before. The music was not new to me, but the reflection was. And it's been incredibly valuable. And I really hope that this has not been a waste of your time. You know, I hope you've gotten something out of this too. The very last thing I will say here, as I've said in previous videos, I too am a singer-songwriter and a performing musician. Throughout this whole process, there's been a voice in my head that said, you know, it's a little bit hacky for your work and content to be evaluations of somebody else's work. That voice has been in my head. But I have to argue against it. I think, you know, every artist does this with their favorite artist's work on some level. You're always making judgments. You're always observing where you're moved and where you're unmoved. This is always happening in artists' heads. It's a perpetual internal process. Doing one's best to verbalize one's impressions and edit it in a way that's not a waste of viewers' time, I don't think is a sin against art. Frankly, I think it's an instructive process and one that more artists should do, whether they feel the need to turn it into videos like me or whether it's just a private thing. I guess what I'm saying is this feels worthwhile to me, and I hope you feel the same way. So, As I said at the beginning of the video, there's a lot more content on the way. I think next I'm gonna crack into Bob Dylan's bootleg series and live albums. And then beyond that, what I'll probably do is deep dives into specific albums and songs, lists of songs and albums through a particular lens, like Bob Dylan's 10 Best Love Songs or something. And then I'll get into other artists. There are other artists that I hold in similar esteem to Bob Dylan. Thank you very much for following the series. If you want to make this more financially feasible for me, I encourage you to like this video, leave a comment expressing whatever appreciation you might have, and subscribe. It goes a longer way than you might realize. With all that being said, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.